"Ma'am, the number you're trying to reach has been disconnected. There is no one left to call. I have 4 hours to get to Fort McLeod, or I break a promise I made over a grave." Corporal Nadia Ferreira Osi, 26, looked at the eviction notice taped to the glass door of her mother's alteration shop. 60 days. She looked back at the old man standing in the sleet, one hand braced against a rusted flatbed truck, the other pressing his ribs like something inside had given way. Then she pulled open the door. "You came to the right place." 3 nights later, 47 RCMP veterans would park their trucks in a half circle around that shop at sunrise. And nobody in Lethbridge, Alberta, was ready for what that old man turned out to be. But first, let me take you back to where this all started. It was a Tuesday in late October, and Nadia had been awake since 4. Not because anything had gone wrong. Everything had gone wrong weeks ago, and she'd moved past the stage of being kept awake by it. Now she woke early out of habit. 5 years of pre-dawn PT, 2 tours, 18 months running logistics for a forward operating base north of Kandahar. The body forgets a lot of things. Rising before the sun is not one of them. She fed the cat, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and walked barefoot across the linoleum floor to the front window of her mother's shop. The sign outside read, "Vivaldi Alterations and Tailoring." Her mother, Consolata Ferreira, had painted it herself in 1999 using a stencil kit from Canadian Tire and a brush she still kept wrapped in cloth in the second drawer. The sign was faded now. The thread of gold paint around the V had peeled down to bare wood. Nadia leaned her forehead against the cold glass. The letter on the counter behind her was from the building owner. 60 days. The lease was going up 40%. Not a negotiation, a notice. Pay the new rate or vacate. The new rate was not something Consolata Ferreira could pay. She was 61 years old. She had been sewing in this shop since Nadia was in grade 3. She had no savings to speak of, no other income, and a daughter who had come home from the army 8 months ago, with full movement in both hands but a medical release she never talked about in the company of strangers. Nadia set her mug on the counter. Her name was Corporal Nadia Ferreira Ose. Ferreira from her mother, Ose from the father who had left when she was 4 and resurfaced once by email a decade later with nothing useful to say. She had enlisted at 19, combat engineer. She spent her 20s doing things she was good at and which the Army required of her, and she was very good at them. And then a roadside device in a culvert on a highway outside Kandahar had ended that particular chapter with a concussion, a ruptured eardrum, and a constellation of smaller injuries that added up to a medical file thick enough to prop a door. She was fine. That is what she told people, and in most of the ways that counted she meant it. But fine did not pay the lease increase. Fine did not keep her mother's shop. She had been working evenings at a security firm on the North End since September. $12 above minimum, cash where possible, nothing that required her to declare it against her disability assessment. She had a jar on the bathroom shelf with $1,400 in it. She had a number on her phone, a recruiter from a private firm out of Edmonton who wanted her for site security in the oil patch. Good money, but 4 weeks on 2 weeks off, which meant leaving her mother alone in a city where she knew fewer people every year because Lethbridge is the kind of place people leave more often than they arrive. Nadia had not called the recruiter back. She had been putting $40 a week in her mother's register drawer since she got home. Consolata had never mentioned it. Nadia had never stopped. Outside, October was doing what October does in southern Alberta. Sleet came in sideways off the coulees. The temperature had dropped 6 degrees since noon. The forecast said it would keep dropping through Wednesday. At 3:14 that afternoon, Nadia heard a sound she recognized before she saw what made it. A diesel engine dying. Not stalling. Dying. The long, uneven rattle of something that had been running on nothing but good intentions for the last 30 kilometers. She stepped out from behind the sewing table where she had been helping her mother with a rush hemming job on a set of curtains. She wiped her hands on a rag. That was when she saw the truck. A 1987 GMC Sierra, faded red, pulling a flatbed trailer with a tarp strapped over something long and heavy. It had coasted to a stop at the curb directly in front of Vivaldi Alterations. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out slowly, the way men climb out of trucks when their hips have been complaining about it for years. He was in his late 60s, maybe older. He wore a canvas work jacket over a plaid shirt. His boots were the kind you buy once and keep resoled for 30 years. He had a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors, and a way of standing that suggested he had once been considerably larger and had not entirely accepted the revision. He leaned against the truck with both hands on the frame and looked at the engine like it had let him down personally. Nadia stepped outside without her jacket. She said, "Need a hand?" The old man looked up. He had pale gray eyes and the kind of composure that comes from a long time spent not saying anything unless it matters. He said, "I don't want to impose, ma'am. I just need a minute." She walked to the front of the truck and crouched. The sleet had found the back of her neck. She ignored it. She said, "Pop the hood." His name was Raymond Sutherland Cross. He told her that after she had been under the hood for 6 minutes and identified the problem. Raymond. People called him Ray. He was 68, widower, retired chief warrant officer, 24 years with the RCMP out of Fort Macleod before that. He had driven up from the Crow's Nest Pass that morning to pick up a machine part for his neighbor's grain auger. Something his neighbor could not source locally, and which Ray, on account of a contact from his service years, had been able to track down in Lethbridge. He had been heading back south when the truck started its death rattle. He was due in Fort Macleod by 8 o'clock that evening. His wife's name had been Pauline. She had died 14 months ago. There was a ceremony that evening at the RCMP Heritage Center, a dedication of a bench in the memorial garden in her name, organized by the officers from Ray's old detachment. He had not missed a single function connected to her memory since the funeral. He did not intend to start now. He told Nadia this while standing to one side, hat in hand, hat getting soaked. He did not tell it easily. He told it the way men of that generation tell things they consider private, in pieces, reluctantly, only because the situation required. Nadia said, "How many kilometers to Fort Macleod?" He said, 112. She said, "When do you need to be there?" He said, 8 o'clock. She looked at her watch. It was 3:47. She went back under the hood. Her mother, Consolata, had appeared in the doorway of the shop. She looked at the truck. She looked at the old man with his hat in the rain. She looked at her daughter crouched in the sleet without a jacket. Consolata Ferreira had come to Canada from Porto in 1987 at the age of 24 with one suitcase and a reference from a woman she had worked for in Lisbon. She had, in the intervening decades, learned to read the situation with a speed and accuracy that impressed people who noticed it. She went inside and put the kettle on. The fuel pump was dead. That was the clean diagnosis. The ugly truth was that the fuel pump was dead. The fuel filter was blocked solid. One of the injector lines had a hairline crack running its full length, and someone at some point had repaired the ignition relay with a piece of wire that had no business being in any vehicle built after 1970. Nadia stood up and wiped her hands. She said, "I'm going to be straight with you, Ray. Parts for a truck this age don't exist in any shop in Lethbridge that's open right now. It's 4 o'clock on a Tuesday. It's October. The dealer closest to us is 40 minutes away, and they close at 5. Raymond Sutherland Cross looked at the hood. His jaw moved once. He said, "I see." The sleet had soaked through his jacket. He did not appear to notice. Nadia looked at the truck. She looked at the tarp on the flatbed. She looked at the eviction notice still visible through the shop window, taped to the inside of the glass. She looked at the old man standing in the rain with his hat in both hands. Then she said, "Go inside. My mother will give you something hot. I'm going to make some calls." What happened in the next 4 hours, Nadia would later tell her mother, was the closest she had felt to her old unit since she got home. Like the part of her brain that had been trained to improvise under constraint had finally been handed a problem worth solving. 4:11. She called a friend from her service years, a woman named Corporal Bridget Fontaine Webb, who now ran a mobile diesel repair outfit out of Coaldale. Bridget did not answer. Nadia left a message, 4:30. She called the parts dealer before they closed. They had nothing for an '87 Sierra fuel system. They said try a wrecker. 4:42. She drove her own truck 3 blocks to the salvage yard on Mayor Magrath Drive. It was closing. She knocked on the chain-link gate until a man in a welding apron came out swearing. She said, "I need a fuel pump, an injector line, and a relay housing for an '87 Sierra. I will pay you for your time, and I will be gone in 20 minutes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the gate. Inside the shop, Consolata brought Ray a cup of tea and sat across from him. Ray held the cup in both hands the way people hold warm things when the cold has been in their bones for a while. He said, "How long has this shop been here?" Consolata said, 24 years. Ray looked around the shop, the bolts of fabric stacked by the window, the 2 sewing machines on the bench, the black and white photograph of Consolata's mother on the wall above the register, a small woman in a good dress standing in a street Nadia had never visited. Ray said, "That's a long time to be in one place." Consolata said, "Yes, we may not have much more of it." Ray looked at her. She did not explain further, but her eyes went once to the notice on the door, and Ray followed them, and he read the notice from where he sat, and then he looked back at his tea. He said, "I'm sorry to hear that." Consolata said, "These things happen." She poured him more tea. She asked about his wife. He told her a little. His voice was very steady, and his hands were very still. And Consolata, who had buried her own mother and her own marriage and rebuilt herself from the remainder, understood what that kind of steadiness costs. She said, "She sounds like someone worth making a trip for." Ray said, "She was the best person I knew." 5:17. Nadia came back from the wreckers with a fuel pump that was close but not exact, an injector line from a slightly different model year, and a relay housing she was going to have to modify with tools her mother did not own. She went to the back of the shop, to the room Consolata used for storage, where there was a workbench her mother had never thrown away because it had belonged to Nadia's grandfather, a man who had fixed engines in Porto until he was 72. The bench was covered in fabric boxes. Nadia moved them to the floor. She found her grandfather's tool roll in the bottom drawer, exactly where it had always been. Consolata stood in the doorway. She said, "You know what you're doing?" Nadia said, "I know what Avo would have done." Her mother stood quietly for a moment. Then she went back to the shop to keep Ray company. 5:41. The power in the neighborhood flickered once. The sleet had turned to freezing rain. 6:08. Nadia modified the relay housing with a file and a pair of snips from the tool roll. Her grandfather had kept everything. She did not know why until this moment. 7:20. She had the fuel pump seated. The injector line was in. The relay was wired in clean. She bled the lines by hand. She stood up. Her back ached. Her fingers were black. The freezing rain was coming down hard enough to blur the shop window. She said to herself, very quietly, the way her grandfather used to say things, "Either it runs or it doesn't." She went to find Ray. He was still sitting in the shop. He had finished the tea. He had his hat on the table beside him, and he was sitting with his hands folded, not looking at anything in particular, the way men sit when they are trying very hard not to count the minutes. She said, "Come outside." He stood up slowly, the way he had gotten out of the truck. He followed her. She opened the driver's door. He got in. He looked at her through the windshield. She said, "Try it." Ray closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he turned the key. The engine coughed. Then silence. Consolata had come outside. She stood on the step with her arms crossed. Nadia leaned in through the passenger window. She reached under the dash and adjusted the relay connection by a half centimeter. She said, "One more time." Ray turned the key. The GMC Sierra started on the second try. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it ran. The exhaust came up white in the cold air, and the idle settled into something steady. Ray sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment. His jaw worked. He said, "Good Lord." Nadia stepped back. She wiped her hands. She realized, been holding her breath. She said, "She'll hold to Fort Macleod. You'll want a full shop to look at it before you drive it hard again. But she'll get you there." Ray got out of the truck. He was looking at her the way people look at something that surprised them more than they intended to allow. He said, "What do I owe you?" She said, "Nothing. The parts were $32. You can cover that if you want." He said, "Ma'am, I'm not going to pay you $32 for what you just did." She said, "That's what's fair, Ray." He looked at her a long moment. His eyes were wet, the kind of wet a person keeps very controlled. He said, "I had 4 officers drive past me on the shoulder today, before I got to you." She did not say anything. He said, $32. He counted it exactly from his wallet. He laid it on the ledge of the passenger window. Nadia looked at it. Then she heard her grandfather's voice. Not from memory, from somewhere older than memory. The place where the people you love talk to you after they're gone. He used to say, "Você faz porque é a coisa certa. Não porque alguém está a contar." You do it because it is the right thing, not because anyone is keeping score. She covered Ray's hand over the money and said, "Thank you. Drive careful. Give Pauline my respects." Something moved behind Ray's eyes, quick, like a door opening and closing. He nodded once. He reached up to his jacket collar, unpinned a small enamel pin, the RCMP crest, worn and smooth from years on the same lapel, and held it out. He said, "You keep that." He set a card on the window ledge, a phone number in plain ink, no name, no title. He said, "Anyone gives you trouble, you call that number. You say Ray sent you. You wait." Then he got back in the truck, backed into the street, and drove south into the freezing rain. Nadia and Consolata stood in the doorway watching his taillights disappear. Consolata put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. She said, "That was the right thing, minha filha." Nadia said, "Yeah." She turned to go inside. That was when she noticed it. On the flatbed under the tarp, the part had shifted when Ray pulled out. A corner of the tarp had folded back. Underneath was the grain auger piece. But underneath that, tucked against the side rail, was a flat leather folder, document-sized, with the initials RSC stamped in the corner. It had slid halfway off the flatbed and was sitting on the wheel well. Ray had already turned the corner. Nadia lifted the folder off the trailer. She took it inside. She did not open it that night. She told herself it was because she was tired, which was partly true. She had used muscles she had not used in 8 months. And her hearing was off the way it sometimes got after too many hours of mechanical noise. And she sat in the kitchen with her mother eating soup and not talking very much, which was the kind of together they had always been best at. She looked at the RCMP crest pin Ray had left. She turned it in her fingers. The enamel was worn down in 2 places on the outside edge, the way something gets worn when it's been handled by a habit rather than a thought. Her mother went to bed. Nadia sat alone at the kitchen table with the leather folder in front of her. She opened it. Inside, a folded map of southern Alberta, dog-eared at the corners. A handwritten list of names. A laminated photograph. She picked up the photograph. It was old, early 90s by the look of the uniforms. A group of RCMP officers at what appeared to be a training exercise. Men in their 20s and 30s, most of them. In the front row, arm around a colleague, was a young man Nadia recognized even without the gray hair, Ray. And beside him, wearing the same uniform, was a face she had not expected to see. The name on the tag below the collar was visible in the photograph. Chief Inspector Maurice O.C. Darko. The name meant nothing to Nadia at first. Then it meant everything. She had seen that name twice in her life. Once on the office door at 33 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters in Edmonton. Once on a commendation letter she had been given on her last day of service for her actions during an incident she was not allowed to discuss in company. The letter had been hand-signed. She had read the signature 17 times and not known the face to match it. She turned the photograph over, written in faded pencil on the back, Ray and Morris, Fort Macleod, 1991. She sat with that for a very long time. The next morning, before her mother woke up, she opened her laptop and searched the name. Chief Inspector Maurice Morris, O.C. Darko, retired. 31 years RCMP, career spanning multiple divisions. Last public position, Director of Operations, National Policy Division, Ottawa. Decorated, retired 2019. Current role, Chair, RCMP Veterans Reintegration Foundation. The Foundation's mandate: to identify former members of the Canadian Armed Forces and RCMP experiencing transition difficulties, and to connect them with housing security, employment pathways, and community resources. Nadia closed the laptop. She did not tell her mother. She was afraid to be right and more afraid to be wrong. 3 days later, it was her mother who called for her. Nadia was in the workroom recovering the bench when Consolata knocked. She said, "There's someone outside." Nadia wiped her hands and walked to the front window. It was not a someone. It was a convoy. 47 trucks, pickups, flatbeds, one decommissioned RCMP cruiser, still in faded white and yellow, had parked along Stafford Drive in both directions. They filled the block and half the next one. A few had flags. Most did not. The drivers were standing outside their vehicles in the October cold, dressed in work jackets and canvas coats, some in uniform pieces, all of them watching the front door of Vivaldi Alterations and Tailoring. Then 3 slow, hard knocks. Consolata grabbed Nadia's arm. Nadia walked to the door. Standing on the step was Raymond Sutherland Cross, cleaned up, jacket pressed, hat in hand. Beside him was a tall man in his late 60s with close-cropped gray hair, a straight back, and a face that was the face from the photograph. Maurice O.C. Darko, Chief Inspector, retired. He removed his hat. He said, "Ms. Ferreira O.C.?" She said. "Yes, sir." He said, "My name is Maurice O.C. Darko. I served with Ray for 11 years. I wonder if we might come in. There are some things owed to you and your mother that I'd like to try to settle this morning." Consolata stepped back from the doorway, one hand on her chest, not quite able to speak. They came inside. The 47 men and women outside did not move. They stood in the cold, hats off, patient as stone. Maurice stood in Consolata's shop, among the bolts of fabric and the humming fluorescent light and the small electric heater ticking in the corner. He stood as men stand who have run rooms their whole lives and have no need to perform it. He said, 3 nights ago, Ray called me from Fort Macleod. He'd just gotten back from a dedication ceremony for his wife. He told me about a woman who had fixed his truck on the side of the road in freezing rain, refused payment, and sent him on his way. He paused. He told me what she said when he tried to give her more money. He said she told him, "That's what's fair." And he said something about that phrase, hit him in a way he could not explain. He looked at Nadia. He said, "Corporal Ferreira Osu, I want to tell you something I have not told many people. 14 years ago, I was stationed in Lethbridge on an internal review. Temporary posting, long hours, and I had gotten very bad news from home. My mother had had a stroke, and I could not get to her. I was sitting outside a shop one morning on Stafford Drive at 6 a.m. because I could not go back to the hotel, and I could not do anything useful with my hands. A woman came out and brought me coffee. She didn't know who I was. She just saw a man sitting outside, looking like the bottom had dropped out. Consolata had gone very still. Maurice said I asked her name. She said Consolata. I asked what the shop was. She said Alterations. I said I'd remember it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small card, an old card, worn at the corners. He set it on the sewing table in front of Consolata. He said, "I kept this for 14 years because I don't throw away things I'm grateful for." Consolata put both hands over her mouth. Nadia felt the floor move under her. Her mother had told her about this once, a decade ago. Nadia had been home on leave, and Consolata had mentioned it in passing. The officer outside in the early morning, the coffee she had brought him, how he had looked like someone at the very end of something. Consolata had not known his name. She had assumed she would never see him again. She had described it the way her mother described acts of kindness, quickly, without emphasis, as if mentioning anything more would be immodest. Nadia stared at the card on the table. Her mother's phone number, her mother's handwriting, 14 years. Maurice said, "Ray didn't know I knew this building. He didn't know that when he called me and described a woman named Ferreira Ossi on Stafford Drive who had fixed his truck and refused his money and said that's what's fair. He didn't know he was describing the daughter of the woman who sat with me at 6 a.m. when I had no one else to talk to." He cleared his throat. He said, "I knew," before he finished the sentence. Consolata broke. Both hands flew to her face, and the sound she made was very small and very human. The kind of sound that has nothing to do with dignity or composure. It had to do with years. Nadia did not move for a long time. She was looking at her grandfather's tool roll on the bench in the back room. The tools that had been there her whole life. The bench she had not known she would need. The folder she had found on the flatbed by accident, or not by accident, or by something she did not have a clean word for. Maurice turned to Nadia. He said, "I have been chair of the Reintegration Foundation for 3 years. We exist specifically to address what happened to people like you, people who served with distinction and came home to a system that moved slower than their needs. I have looked at your file." He said it simply, without preamble. She did not ask how he had accessed it. She understood that a person of his position and his years knew how to do what needed doing. He said, "You were medically released 8 months ago. You received the minimum transition benefit and a disability assessment that does not fully reflect your injuries. You have been working 2 jobs to support your mother. You declined a recruitment offer from the oil patch because it would have meant leaving her alone." He looked at her directly. He said, "You know what that tells me?" She said nothing. He said, "It tells me you've been holding the whole weight of this by yourself, and you haven't asked for anything, because you were trained not to ask for anything, and that is exactly the kind of person this foundation was built for." He reached into the leather case he had brought with him and set 3 documents on the sewing table. He said, "With your permission." The first document, the foundation had identified the building owner of Vivaldi Alterations and contacted him directly. The lease increase had been retracted. The current rate was locked in for 5 years at existing terms, with an option to extend. The negotiation had taken 48 hours. Consolata looked at the document. She read it twice. She did not speak. The second document, Nadia's disability assessment, had been formally appealed through the foundation's legal arm. A specialist review had been initiated. Her benefit rate was being recalculated retroactive to her release date. A lump sum adjustment would be deposited in the next 30 days, an amount large enough that Nadia's hands were shaking before she finished reading. She did not cry. She had long since cried about this in private, which is the only place she cried about anything. What she felt instead was something she had not felt in 8 months, the specific quiet relief of a weight being set down. Maurice set the 3rd document on the table. He said, "You have an engineering background and advanced field mechanics training. The foundation has a partnership with Public Safety Canada on a new community infrastructure program. Small towns and rural communities with aging infrastructure and no specialist labor. We are building a team of 12. We need someone to lead field operations in southern Alberta. It is a permanent position, full federal benefits. It starts when you're ready." Nadia looked at him. He said, "You would be based in Lethbridge," she said. "I wouldn't have to leave," he said. "No." She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them, her grandfather's hands, her mother's hands, not her father's hands. She was grateful for that particular inheritance. She said, "Yes, I'll take it." Maurice nodded. He reached into the case one more time and set a small flat box on the table. He did not open it. He slid it toward Nadia. He said, "This is from Ray." She opened it. Inside, in a strip of foam, was an engraved name bar, the the kind attached to uniforms. It had her name. Below her name, one line. "In the field, we do not leave each other behind," Maurice said. "Ray served 24 years. He doesn't give many things. He wanted you to have that." He stood. He picked up his hat. He said, "There are 47 people outside who drove here this morning because Ray made one phone call and told them what you did. These are people who spent their careers in service. They recognize that instinct when they see it. They are not easily moved." He looked out the window at them. 47 people standing in the Alberta cold, not moving. He said, "They moved for you." The story was in the Lethbridge Herald 2 days later. A small item at first, inside pages, below the fold. Then the CBC South Alberta desk picked it up. Then a national wire service ran a short version. The headline was, "Veteran mechanic fixes officer's truck, refuses pay, and changes the course of her family's life." Letters arrived at Vivaldi Alterations. A retired teacher from Red Deer wrote on the back of a grocery list. A nurse from Prince George sent a card. A man from Winnipeg wrote 3 sentences in French, and Consolata read them standing at the register and did not translate them for Nadia but kept the card in the drawer beneath the till. Consolata re-lettered the shop sign herself. Same stencil kit from 1999. Same brush, same drawer. She did not change the name. She did not need to. Maurice Osidarko visited 4 times that first year. He ate Consolata's bacalhau at the kitchen table and talked about his mother, who had recovered from the stroke and outlived 3 of her doctors. Ray came once in the spring, in the same red truck, newly repaired by a shop in Fort Macleod. He brought a pot of his late wife Pauline's choke-sherry jam, which Consolata received with the gravity one receives a thing that comes from someone's loss. She opened it on a Sunday morning, and they ate it on toast and said very little. Nadia started the infrastructure position in January. She spent the first season in the field with a team of 6, patching water systems and reinforcing bridges in communities that had been waiting for years for someone to show up with the right tools. She slept in trailers and worked 12-hour days and came home to Lethbridge on the weekends and sat with her mother at the kitchen table and did not feel, for the first time in a long time, like she was somewhere she was not supposed to be. The RCMP Veterans Reintegration Foundation quietly named a new field program after the following year, the Consolata Nadia Initiative, for women in the Canadian Armed Forces and RCMP navigating transition. The naming was Maurice's idea. He ran it past Consolata before he filed the paperwork. She said yes, but asked if they could include a line in the mission statement about community, because that is where it had started, and that is where it should point. They included the line. On a Thursday morning in early November, exactly 1 year from the day Ray's truck had coasted to the curb on Stafford Drive, Nadia unlocked the shop at 6 a.m., the way she sometimes did when Consolata needed rest, and made the first pot of coffee, and stood at the window in the dark watching the street come back to itself. At 6:14, a car pulled over. A young woman, maybe 22, got out with her hood up against the cold. She looked at the engine. She looked at the street. She looked at the shop window. Nadia opened the door before she could knock. She said, "Come in out of the cold. What's going on with your car?" The young woman looked at her. She had been crying or was close to it. She said, "I don't know. It just stopped. I have to get to work by 7. I can't be late again." Nadia said, "Let me get my jacket. My mother will put on coffee." It took 11 minutes, a loose battery terminal and a cracked ground strap, things that look catastrophic and are not. The young woman tried to give her $10 from her coat pocket. It was folded small, the way people fold money they are counting carefully. Nadia closed her hand around it and gave it back. She said, "When someone you don't owe anything to needs help, you help them. That's how we pay each other back here." The young woman stood in the cold for a moment looking at her. Then she got in her car and drove toward the sunrise. Nadia locked up. She paused at the door of the shop, her hand on the frame, the sign above her. The stenciled letters her mother had painted 24 years ago with a brush still wrapped in cloth in the second drawer. She thought about her grandfather's tool roll, about a photograph in a leather folder, about coffee brought to a stranger at 6 in the morning by a woman who did not know the stranger's name and did not require it. She turned off the light. She said quietly to no one in the room, "I see it now, Mai. Same as you saw it. Same as Avo." Outside on Stafford Drive, the first gray light was coming up over the coulees. Inside the second drawer, the old paintbrush waited, wrapped in cloth, ready for the next time someone needed it.